From authoritarianism to reform, Ethiopia's Prime Minister brings new hope to the country. But how long will it last? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Abiy Ahmed. They say change comes in many forms, and in Ethiopia, it's arrived in the man, Abiy Ahmed. In just 6 months, the Ethiopian Prime Minister has lifted a state of emergency, released thousands of activists from jail, and signed a peace deal with Eritrea, just to name a few. Not so long ago, these reforms would have been unthinkable. So how has he done it? Well, for one, he's the first leader from the Oromo people. That's an ethnic group that's felt politically marginalized for years. But with Abiy at the helm, things seem to be improving. Although not everyone's pleased with the new Prime Minister. Ethnic conflict has been rife during his term. 23 people were killed in an Oromo heartland, leading to protests urging the government to restore law and order. Natalie Perhanan has been following Abiy's rise and has this exclusive report from Addis Ababa.
Ethiopia is one of the world's oldest nations. It's a land once led by emperors and home to more than 80 ethnic groups. For almost 3 decades, it's been ruled by the same government, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or EPRDF. But this year, change has come to Ethiopia. This change has a name: Abiy Ahmed. There's a carnival-like atmosphere on the streets of Addis Ababa. It's almost like a welcome home parade for a victorious football team, except these people are here to see opposition leaders returning from exile.
Having this flag was a crime. Participating freely was a crime. But now, thanks to the new government, we're having this end, and I see a light at the end of the tunnel now.
Months ago, a scene like this wouldn't have been possible. The party these people support, the patriotic Ginbot 7, was a declared terrorist organisation. It was engaged in an armed struggle against the government. But it's laid down its weapons to support the reform process Abiy Ahmed started when he came to power in April.
For me, and maybe for most of my friends, is a beginning of democratizing the whole country and creating a functional state that works for all of us equally.
At the Addis Ababa Stadium, the General Secretary of the PG7, Andargacho Sege, gets a roaring reception. He tells them the party stands with those people who want to change the nation, and he name-checks the Prime Minister. In May, Andargacho was still on death row for his role in the party. He is one of thousands of political prisoners released on Abiy's orders, and maybe one of the most famous. Now he wants to work with the Prime Minister to build a democratic nation.
He's played a very important role, Dr. Abiy. But the demand for change and the sustenance of the change doesn't depend only on him. You know, the people of Ethiopia will never allow anyone now to dictate them in the way they used to be dictated. You know. There would be an uprising that any dictator could not control using any means.
He says opposition groups have a key role to play.
There is really a likelihood that if we don't solve our problems, political and other problems, this country, this ancient country with long history, could simply crack up, you know, and it would be impossible to control it once that has happened. So the opposition should realize there is a need for patience, need for cooperation, to give priority to peace and stability and the rule of law.
I ask him what his greatest fear is.
I think it would be the ethnic division that was deliberately sowed by the past regime, and at how it would evolve, in the coming months or a year,
There have been sporadic bursts of mob violence between different ethnic groups in the past few months. The Prime Minister has called for calm. This is a fragile time for peace. To get an understanding of the divisions, you need to head to the Oromia region, which surrounds Addis Ababa. It's home to the Oromo people, one of the country's largest ethnic groups, which has long called for greater representation. These young men are keros, a term used to describe unmarried Oromo men. Men like them were at the forefront of demonstrations which ultimately led to a change in the country's leadership. Bonsa Ewanatu is a kero. He's proud of his role in mobilising other young Oromos to take part in the protests.
The Oromos have been asking for equal recognition of language, culture, their tradition, especially on their land.
In 2015, thousands rallied against the government's Addis Ababa master plan. It was designed to expand the capital by stretching into Oromia and taking away farmland. The protests were initially peaceful, but they turned deadly when authorities used force to try to stop them. It had the opposite effect. Demonstrations spread to other parts of the country as different ethnic groups rallied against government oppression. By 2018, the mass anti-government protests were still happening, leading to the resignation of the former Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, and the ascension of Abiy. He is the first Oromo to hold the role of PM. For Bonsa, the fight isn't over, it's in a new phase.
I need to have a country where there is a democracy, where human rights is highly respected, a country where no one would not be beaten or thrown to jail because he expressed his own feeling. So we are in a transition. The better things are yet to come. So it's not an end. Our protest might change its strategy. I don't think there will be the blocking of the roads or the boycott of the market and so on. We will pressurize the government to look for the better solutions.
Farmers were one of the groups most affected by the land grabs. We're about to meet a farmer who used to own a lot of the land surrounding me. But because of government confiscations, he's lost most of it. His name is Girma Wakjire. Girma used to raise animals and grow wheat, chickpeas and maize. Now he's fenced in. He didn't want to give up his land. He says he felt pressured by the authorities and accepted a small amount of compensation. When he built his family compound years ago, he was surrounded by land. Now, everywhere he turns, there's construction.
Abasat arge kana kuno gafafani to fudatan kino nata tere dalla kana kaabeto nu malbe ina no rida nu awalan kuno akati nu awalan malango wani bichai sana awal akati kuno jedani me o aki mangistin kuni inno na anamoti yollu matenya fille aki andabar sutai malango.
It's that kind of pain which Abiy acknowledged in his first address to Parliament.
ይገባንም ነበር።
The 42-year-old has risen through the ranks of the EPRDF. The coalition has had an iron grip on the country for the last 27 years. Abiy is viewed as a reformer. He says his dream is to hold democratic elections by 2020.
ምርጫን በሚመለከት ቀርቧል ቢራዘም ለውጡ የተጀመረው አሁን ነው የሚለው በግል እምነቴ ትክክለኛ ነው። እኔ የኢትዮጵያን ሕዝብ ማገልገል የምፈልገው በሚቀጥለው ምርጫ ካሸነፍኩ ብቻ ነው። ሳላሸንፍ አሁን በሆነው መንገድ የለውጡን ጊዜ አሁን ያለው የሚቀረውን ጊዜ መምራት ያ እንዲራዘም የመግፋት ፍላጎት እኔም ድርጅቱም እስካሁን የለውም። ወደፊት ሀሳቡ የሚነሳ ከሆነ በውይይት ለህዝብ ይሆናል።
Opening up the culture of one coalition rule to include outside voices doesn't come without risk. In June, 2 people died when a grenade was thrown into a crowd after Abiy had finished speaking. This is the season of renewal in Ethiopia. The country follows its own calendar. The new year only began in September. There's more to celebrate than usual, like the prospect of transforming from authoritarian rule to an open state.
This is Meskel Square. It's one of the key gathering places in Addis Ababa. Just a few days ago, it was packed with tens of thousands of opposition supporters, a sign of the changes in Ethiopia. Now it's back to business as usual, with people going about their daily lives. But for many of them, they're hoping that they've entered a new era in the country.
Journalist Eskinder Nega was jailed several times under the old EPRDF regime. His wife, another journalist, was also imprisoned and gave birth to their son in jail. They now live in the US. But Eskinder has returned to relaunch a magazine which was closed down under the old government.
What we have discovered by trying to work as independent journalists in the country is that we could not create an island of freedom in a sea of dictatorship. To enjoy and to work as journalists, as independent journalists, as free journalists, there has to be democracy. So whether we like it or not, we have to fight for democracy.
He says the country should follow South Africa's model of creating a transitional government.
Political party, particularly one that has an authoritarian past, cannot be a credible force in creating the independent institutions that the country needs to engage in a free election. So we need a coalition of the major political parties to create that credible environment for a free and fair election. Without a free and fair election, it will be back to square one for us.
The optimism around Abiy is riding high. People want him to succeed because it could mean lasting change for the nation. Bekele Gerba is another former political prisoner. I ask him what he thinks about the Prime Minister.
For some reason, my inner side tells me that he's a good person, he's a reformist, and I think he is serious about reforming. He doesn't have that history of corruption, and he looks like as a clean person. And even though he was part of the security when I was sent to prison, I still sense that he is one of those people whose hands are clean.
But Bekele is also wary.
Many governments in this country, at the beginning of their reign, they are usually progressive. They look like okay. But as time goes on, and when they think that they are going to be pushed out of office, they will begin to resist, change the laws, and become brutal.
Abiy came to office 6 months ago. His image can be found across the capital. It's not the government keeping his picture up, it's the people. Another sign of the optimism surrounding this young leader. and the expectation that he can transform this old nation. Natalie Pohanen in Addis Ababa for the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, we're joined now from Addis Ababa by Mohammed Ademo. He's an Oromo journalist and editor of the online magazine opride.com. We have Awal Alo, who's a lecturer in law at Keele University in the UK. And in Washington, D.C. is journalist and activist Abebe Gello. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Mohammed, let me start with you. Abe Mania, as they call it. Is there more hope or is there more hype? Where do you stand?
I think this country has never been more hopeful. I think there is a great deal of hope and optimism, and people are jealously guarding this moment against those who want to maintain the status quo. I think Abiy Mania is an understatement because the Prime Minister has ushered in reforms at a speed this country has never seen, from the release of prisoners to the review of some of the repressive laws, rapprochement with Eritrea. There's a laundry list of changes that he has introduced, and generally there's a feeling in this country that there is no more better qualified to lead this country through this transition.
Abebe, let me understand and help me understand how symbolically significant it was when we had the Oromo Liberation Front not being treated as terrorists anymore and the leaders returning to the capital with their flag. Tell me what that meant.
It means a lot because the Oromo People's Liberation Front, OLF, was labeled as a terrorist organization, as he pointed out, by the previous TPLF-dominated regime. The country has taken a reform to a higher level, under the leadership of Abiy Ahmed. And it's not only the return of the OLF, which is significant. The return of the patriotic Gimbo Sabat leadership is also a momentous event in Ethiopian political history, especially after Abiy Ahmed has been elected. The reform is going well, and I believe that taking this kind of measure will pave the way for a better future for Ethiopia.
Abebe, at the first sign of trouble, when there were clashes, the first spasm of trouble, if you like, we saw that the state blocked mobile internet, more than 1,000 people were arrested. So for many, they've seen this movie before. Does that suggest that reform's going to take a long time because ultimately the state still reflexively responds in the way it has over the past couple decades?
That's actually true in the sense that this reform will not be easy. There will be obstacles on the way, but generally speaking, the steps that have been taken by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed will pave the way for a greater reform. That's my opinion. But as you pointed out, there are also problems here and there. There are ethnic clashes. One of the obstacles for the reform agenda of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is ethnic politics. Ethnic politics has been intensified for various reasons. The return of the OLF has also amplified that because it's basically an ethnic-based group.
Right.
But if the reform continues unabated, I believe that the Prime Minister will be able to steer the way towards a better future.
So, we have Abiy saying, I'm not a king. My ultimate objective is to see democratic elections in Ethiopia. If that happened, I'll feel I fulfilled my objective. Do you believe him, Awal?
I certainly do. I think he's very genuine. He's very determined when he says those things. And I have been watching the Ethiopian political scene for the last 5-6 years, and I don't think I have ever seen any individual, both within the ruling coalition and within the opposition, who have the political capital, the cultural appeal, and as well as the dynamism and organizational competence that can kind of steer this country out of this troubled water. So I certainly believe him, yes.
Mohammed Ademo, we heard from Abebe that ethnic politics have been amplified recently. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think the return of Gimbo 7 in OLF means that there are groups that has divergent aspiration, divergent political persuasions coming to the country. They bring their political perspective, and this whole ethnicized conflict started when Gimbo 7 returned in the country, was literally awash with a flag that was outlawed under the previous government. And when OLF came, the Oromo activists who support the OLF wanted to put up their flags, and some of the Gimbo 7 supporters, alleged supporters, wanted to prevent that, and that sort of led to a standoff, and it was mishandled. But I think this is a multinational federation, and ethnicity has always been around, and the country is organized along ethnic lines. It's not a perfect system, but I think it needs to be tested. This idea that the return of OLF somehow led to intensification of ethnic politics is, I think, a little bit inaccurate. We need to manage it. I think we need to find a way to balance between opening up, but also making sure that people respect the law of the land, and there are symbols and narratives that we don't agree on. I think we need civic conversations around those issues so that we can settle, we can agree on a flag for this nation, for example, and many other issues that we need to talk about. But I think the fear of ethnicity it just shows that maybe a political predisposition of certain groups and certain individuals who see ethnicity as the boogeyman, whereas this is a country emerging from authoritarianism, and people feel free, and it's almost as if the frustrations and the anger, their aspirations has been bottled up, and now you open it up, and that is leading to instances of people taking the law onto their hands and being a bit territorial here and there.
Abebe, has the man just given a strong rebuttal of your point?
I don't think so, because ethnic politics has been a major problem in Ethiopia for the last 27 years. Because the TPLF wanted, to put in place a divide and rule strategy to rule Ethiopia. As a result of that, we have ethnic federation and a constitution based on ethnicity. Ethnicity, as you know, is one of the main sources of conflict around the world. There are no longer many conflicts between countries, but conflicts among ethnic groups has destabilized so many countries. And it led to, the disintegration of countries like the former Yugoslavia, and it led to genocide in Rwanda. So Ethiopia will face a major problem from ethnic politics. There is no doubt about that. Because as long as people are organized for political objectives around ethnicity, there will be conflict of interests. These conflicting interests will definitely lead to destabilization of the country.
But given
if I give you an example, for instance, from January to June this year, around 1.4 million people have been displaced in Ethiopia, topping Syria and the Congo Democratic Republic. So this is not because of a peaceful transition along ethnic line, but because of ethnic conflicts.
Right.
So if ethnicity is not addressed in Ethiopia, it will continue to be a major problem, and it will undermine the reform agenda of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed.
Okay, so Abebe, isn't it interesting though that this man, as the Prime Minister with his mixed background, is able to absorb a lot of this because his father was Muslim and his, I think, mother was Orthodox, and he's a Protestant right now and he's an Oromo and so forth. So he ticks a lot of boxes for enough people to trust him. Isn't that the whole point? What you're saying is that you have hypothetical fears that Ethiopia might return back to old grievances, but isn't this the right man to take you forward?
I don't have any doubt that Abiy Ahmed is the right man to take Ethiopia forward. As you pointed out, he has a very interesting background, mixed background, Christian Oromo, Muslim background, which is very interesting in Ethiopia. This mixed background is an asset for him. But at the same time, Ethiopia has 80 ethnic groups, around 80 ethnic groups with their own political groups and conflicting aspirations and interests. So this will be a major obstacle. That's why I said ethnicity will be a major obstacle for the Prime Minister, despite his background, despite the fact that he wants to unify the country and take it forward.
And let me go to Awal Alo as we look at the big picture here. The man's been in office
if I may.
Okay, come in, Mohammed. So, Awal, my apologies. I'm going to come to you in a minute, but Mohammed wants to jump in. Mohammed?
I just want to make sure that, I used to sit where Ababa is sitting right now, and the reality of the matter on this side is the Prime Minister is on the record, and several law enforcement officials have been on the record saying that there are groups who want to exploit ethnic differences, ethnic fault lines in this country. You can look at the problems that we've seen in between the Somali and Oromo communities along the eastern border. The conflict that Ababa was mentioning between the Guji Oromo and the Gedio in few other episodes of ethnic unrest. Those things are those instances are at least based on the official information, including from the Prime Minister, which Abiy says that is the right man to lead this country. These are being instigated by the old guard and elements within the deep state who wants to return to the status quo. I think we need to look at the facts, and I'm not suggesting that there is no ethnic dimension to these conflicts, but there are groups who are exploiting those fault lines, and I think we need to look at that and have a conversation, serious conversation about how do we move from here forward into democracy, but also find an arrangement that works for everyone, not necessarily my perspective or the perspective of Abiy and the Gimbot 7 or some other groups who wants to return to sort of a more unitary form of government. And I think this is a very diverse nation, and ethnic federalism or the multinational federalism celebrates those pluralism and those diversity. I think we need to embrace that. We need to find a balance where we celebrate our diversity without necessarily building boundaries and need to re-educate our people. Abiy is right in saying that the previous government has used a divide and rule strategy to try to tell people this is your piece of the land and nobody else belongs here other than yourself. We need to re-educate people. I don't think the problem fundamentally is of the structure, but it's the way it has been instrumentalized and the way it has been abused, in the fact that it has never been implemented, in the fact that those same groups are now trying to exploit the same fault lines for their political benefits.
Now, unfortunately, we've lost Awal Alo at Kiel University due to a technical issue. That's really unfortunate. But let me go back to you, Abebe. Mohammed said, I used to be in your position, Abebe, and I remember as well talking to Mohammed when he was coming out of DC, being critical of the government. He was critical of a different administration. He was critical of Haile Mariam Desalegn, and we used to have these statements from the Ethiopian embassy in the UK. That was kind of the best we could ever get from the Ethiopian government back then a couple years ago. And Mohammed was on the other side of the fence being highly critical of the government. It reminds me of the diaspora. Let me ask you, Abebe, what will it take for Ethiopians in the diaspora to go back home and to have enough trust in Abiy Ahmed and enough trust in the future to leave their lives, their jobs, and whatever they're doing, whether it's in DC or the UK, and say, we want to give it a shot back home?
Thank you again. The Ethiopian diaspora has embraced Dr. Abiy Ahmed, since he came power. People have given him endorsement. Well-known activists and dissidents have praised his leadership. And in fact, the man has been incredible. He's bold in taking actions. He has transformed the political landscape, there is no doubt about that. But at the same time, the system has not changed. Even if there is a change of leadership, the system remains intact. The TPLF has still got presence, significant presence in the current system. And they are trying to undermine this prime minister in many, many ways. Mohammed mentioned what is also happening, especially in terms of instigating ethnic violence in many parts of the country, and people still believe that the TPLF is behind it. So the TPLF wants to return to the past, to restore the status quo. As long as this internal power struggle is going on, I don't think that people will have patience and trust for so long. So, significant steps must be taken to purge those elements within the system that undermine not only the Prime Minister, but the progress that the country is making. If the situation stabilizes, I'm sure so many people can return home and contribute their share, for the progress of the country, including myself. I have been in exile for the last 20 years, and I would like to return to my country. It's my country. I would like to contribute whatever I can for the transformation of Ethiopia, which has suffered a lot under succeeding regimes and tyrants. So it all depends on how this reform plays out in the near future.
Okay, so Mohammed, Abebe wants to return home, but he's being cautious because he fears the deep state and he fears those who are trying to undo and unravel all the good work that Abiy has envisaged and has already done. Is that a fair point? Is the man being reasonable?
No, I think anyone, including Abebe, is welcome to come here. And as you pointed out in the lead up to the question, I was very critical of the government, as critical of the government as Abebe have been. I'm here. I feel free. I feel at home. I'm trying to do my best to support this administration. I'm trying to talk to people and try to bring about understanding between different groups and different communities. The media here lacks capacity. I'm working with different groups and trying to help professionalize the media, trying to bring people from abroad who are also interested in being part of this change. I think at this point, yes, there are problems. Yes, the TPLF and it is intelligence apparatus, it is security interests are around, and they very much wants to pull us back. But the last time I was on this program, I pointed out that there are two centers of power. That's the power of the people and the power of those that have the guns, or the deep state as we call it. I think Abiy has done a very good job of consolidating the popular support that he has generated. That cuts across all kinds of political divides. For that reason alone, I think people are, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, protective of the Prime Minister. You talk to Ethiopians in Addis Ababa, their primary concern is the security of the Prime Minister, and because they know that there are groups that would, if they can, like to harm him. But all that said, I think anyone can come and you will not be stopped at the airport. You can do whatever you want here, set up shop. Abebe's network has opened an office here. I don't see why Abebe doesn't have the confidence to come here when people who lead the organization that have been categorized as terrorist organizations are here and organizing and talking to people. So I think the diaspora should come. This is a great time to come and help Ethiopia move forward.
Okay, well, Abebe is giving it some time. We're all giving him some time, and everybody's watching Ethiopia. It's a tremendous time for the country right now. Next time on the Newsmakers, we'll take a high definition, higher resolution look at the thaw between Ethiopia and Eritrea. But for the moment, gentlemen, I have to move on. I thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers, Mohammed Ademo, Abebe Gallo, and also, unfortunately, we lost his window, Awal Allo. Thanks again, gentlemen. Still to come on the program, an army reservist accused of spying for China is arrested in Chicago. Was he really an agent? And how many more spies are there? Chinese citizen Ji Chaoqun arrived in the US on a student visa. Now he's been arrested for working as a spy for Beijing. His story is a remarkable one. After studying engineering in the state of Illinois, he enlisted in the US Army using a program designed for foreign residents. But Washington says he's been recruiting for the Chinese government. It sounds like a Hollywood thriller, but in reality, it's just the latest in a long history of spy games between two of the world's superpowers. For more, here's Randolph Nogel.
The most recent blowback in U.S.-China relations transpired in the Windy City. A 27-year-old Chinese national was arrested in Chicago last week, accused of espionage. The man in question, known as Chaoqun, came to the U.S. in 2013 on a student visa. The following year, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Reserve, but failed to disclose his foreign contacts to the military. Federal prosecutors have charged him with acting as an agent of a foreign power. Ji is accused of helping China recruit Americans for the purpose of espionage. His arrest comes as the U.S. and China are locked in a high-stakes trade war, and as U.S. counterintelligence officials step up efforts to combat what they say is an extensive global network of spies operated by China's Ministry of State Security. U.S. counterintelligence chief William Abenina has accused China of an aggressive campaign to recruit Americans via the career networking site LinkedIn. And the head of the FBI's intelligence branch has said 70% of China's spy operations are aimed at the private sector. In the last year, China has been accused of operating spy rings in Germany and France. And the French newspaper Le Monde reported Beijing has been spying on the African Union since 2012.
It is preposterous, absurd. Le Monde is regarded as a serious French newspaper, and I'm so surprised by the report.
This most recent arrest follows a former CIA officer being charged with spying for Beijing earlier this year, possibly in connection with an unraveling of U.S. spy networks in China. Between 2010 and 2012, the Chinese government reportedly dismantled CIA spying operations in the country, killing or jailing more than a dozen CIA sources. But perhaps even more alarming for U.S. national security is alleged cyber espionage orchestrated by Beijing. The U.S. Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats has warned China's growing technological capabilities with regard to cyber spying is a bigger threat than Russia's attempts to influence the U.S. elections. In the world of spies, it's hard for anyone on the outside to know who's winning and who's losing. But it seems in the U.S., alarm bells are ringing over Beijing's rise as a global power of espionage. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, we have James Lewis from Washington, D.C. He's the Senior Vice President and Program Director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also advised the U.S. government on national security and concerns over spying related to high-tech trade with China. Joining us from Beijing is Chaoqun. He's a political analyst specializing in Chinese affairs. And completing our panel in Boston is former CIA officer Glenn Carl. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. James Lewis, let me begin with you. This guy, Chaoqun, arrested. The feds seem to think that he's a spy. Do you think he's a spy?
Probably. There's a lot of them floating around the U.S.
And tell me why.
Well, for decades, really, China has had a campaign to acquire Western technology, advanced technology, and they use a combination of techniques, including human spies. So if you were to talk to sources in the U.S. intelligence community, they would tell you that Chinese spying is at a peak that we've never seen before.
Right, that's interesting, a peak that we've never seen before. Chaoqun, according to a court affidavit, Ji was working at the direction of a, quote, high-level intelligence officer in China's Ministry of State Security. That was his handler, right, which handles civilian intelligence collection and is responsible for counterintelligence and foreign intelligence as well as political security. So does this seem plausible to you?
Frankly speaking, I don't know, because all the information we have been reading or hearing is from the accusation, the U.S. government side, and we don't know. We don't hear from this guy explaining his case or speaking for himself, or his lawyers speaking for himself. But anyway, let's assume he's a spy for China or for any other country. I wouldn't be surprised. China, US, Russia, big countries, France, or at some point involved in, spying activities, including industrial espionage. If you look at the CIA structure, actually, 2 out of 4, the director department over there, actually 2 of them are concerned about with, a collection of technical scientific information. So big countries is doing that, so it's not surprising.
Right. Glenn Carl, are they both doing it, the United States and China?
Well, I'm only aware of one country in the world that I think doesn't have an intelligence service. So the answer in general will, of course, be yes. In particular, as our colleagues just pointed out, for large powers, great powers, like the United States and China, and then 2 countries that have overlapping and increasingly tense relations, such as China and the United States. There have been, I believe the number is 155 or more arrests by the FBI in the last 5 to 10 years of individuals who are accused of conducting espionage for China in the United States. So tensions in the espionage world between the 2 countries have been rising for a number of years in correlation with the increasing rivalry and tensions between China and the United States.
Yeah, in a time of a trade war as well. James Lewis, the interesting thing about this particular guy is that he had the fast-track visa program through the Mavni program. So he came in on a student visa, he got his degree, then he enlisted, and you can get fast-track residency and be put on the path to citizenship if you join the armed forces. A lot of people have gone this route, and it's been very enticing for many people who have unique skills, whether they speak Mandarin or Farsi and so forth. There's been a lot of question marks about this program, and in 2016 it was actually suspended, right, because of national security concerns. Were authorities vindicated in suspending it, given that this guy might quite likely be a spy who gamed the system?
No, I think that we still benefit more from letting people in than we do from keeping them out. And particularly when you look at high-tech industries, highly skilled individuals, we have to have some way, we, the United States, have to have some way to bring these people in, let them work in our economy. What we've seen, though, in the past is that first-generation immigrant Chinese students and workers are more susceptible to recruitment by Chinese intelligence agencies. And so what this means is keep the program, maybe put a little more effort into counter-espionage to identify the people who will be recruited.
Glenn Carl, are we at sort of Cold War levels of espionage between the United States and China, but just replace Russia with China? Is that where we're at?
I wouldn't put it at the level of the Cold War, no, but certainly increasing rivalry. China is returning to its historic position as a global power, and the United States is not in decline, but in relative loss of hegemony. So the rivalry increases, but as Mr. Lewis and our other colleague in Beijing commented, these are the normal frictions and activities of states. I also would like to reemphasize or agree with strongly Mr. Lewis's point that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There will always be espionage and tensions and competing rivalries, but the net benefit for the United States of having a robust immigrant program are so far outweigh the costs of finding spies that it would be foolish to harm ourselves.
Shu, on the other side of the coin, help me understand how it went down when the New York Times broke that story last year of China dismantling a suspected CIA spy ring. And this, I mean, they really crippled it, right? This was between 2010 and 2012. Multiple reports. The New York Times said about 30 people were executed. Foreign Policy doubles that number and says it was much, much, much more. Help me understand how that went down in China and what it meant to the Chinese that they felt they dismantled a US-run spy ring.
Well, that's a spectacular story, let's say, because in general, folks on the street have little knowledge or information about what's really going on between government agencies, especially spying agencies, or spying on each other. First of all, I agree with my colleague. That's a normal thing. Secondly, of course, dismantling a spy network within China like that is something. Let's say that's something. Let me call it achievement for the Chinese side. Through whatever hard work they have done. I would say if this happened in the United States or in Russia, that's also normal. We are spying against each other at the same time. We are trying to protect ourselves from being spied on. This is just two sides of this effort of spying, let's say.
Glenn Carl, what was the lesson for the United States after the Chinese took out that program pretty brutally?
Well, we have no illusions about the Chinese counterintelligence authorities and legal system being kind-hearted, really, with regard to people it catches or accuses of espionage. The lesson is that is not a new one. You always need to have a rigorous and ceaseless counterintelligence effort, so that your own efforts are not penetrated, be it your service or your actions abroad. It was a catastrophe apparently for the United States intelligence community, and you don't let doubts go unpursued. That's all you can do.
James, who has greater capability between the United States and China when it comes to espionage?
Right now, I'd still have to say the U.S. The Chinese have had spectacular successes really over the last decade or two, and a lot of it involves cyber espionage. But the U.S. capabilities, both in technical acquisition, still outpace China. They're closing fast. On the human intelligence side, I think the issue is there's more Chinese who are eager to get out of China than there are Americans who are eager to get in, and that's just going to give you a recruitment advantage. So overall, advantage to the U.S., but the gap is narrowing.
Right. And Shu, let me fold in some news from May when France had detained two former foreign intelligence agents on suspicion of spying for China. These were French nationals on suspicion of spying for China. Let's just assume that's true. Assume that, that happened, right? What does that say about China's reach and its adaptability globally?
Well, frankly speaking, I know very little about that. The case against the case on spying the French. I'm not sure if that's the true case and what they are looking for from the French, let's say. And spying, there are different kinds of types of spying. Let's say some for industrial information. That's more common. Let's say even between companies, they want to steal some information from their opponents. So that's normal. Some in terms, it's related to national security, strategic plans or information of that nature. That's also quite normal between big powers. But France is not, let's say, opponent or potential rivalry, a rival of China. No, I would be surprised if that's a true case.
Glenn, big picture, how much has the game changed? I mean, I'm assuming poison-tipped umbrellas never existed in the first place, but as was mentioned, cyber spying, cyber espionage, and so forth, and hacking and that type of thing. Is that front and center when it comes to espionage these days? And are intelligence agencies playing catch-up with new stuff that we struggle really to understand?
Oh, well, I think I'll differ with you a little bit here. Poison-tipped umbrellas have always existed in one form or
we've heard it from the CIA, so it's true.
If you can think of a technique, then probably it will be used. Murphy's Law, something can go wrong, it will. And if a technique or a technology can be used in one way or another, it will. What's new in the game is that China is emerging from a century of struggle and internal problems, and now for the first time in history, not just the largest and becoming possibly the most powerful country in the world by certain measures, but is actively playing a global role and not just, frankly, a regional one. That's what's different. The interests and clashes of states are not different. The rivalries between the U.S., which has been the arbiter in the Pacific since World War II, And China, which is now extending its influence, is new in the post-war or ex-post-war world, and that's the only change. Otherwise, intelligence services will continue to pursue their country's national interests aggressively.
Right. James, what would it take for either side to do in order to unravel the political relationship or to cause real mayhem and to have the two on high alert? At what level of espionage are we talking about that becoming a reality?
It's so far as my colleagues have said, the contest between the U.S. and China has been fairly traditional, focused on the Chinese side on military and technology, and on the U.S. side on politics and military secrets. So I don't think there's much risk there. This would be a worsening of tensions in the relationship if something happened outside of espionage. Espionage is a tool. It's not usually the driver. The Russians, yes, in 2016 had some very exciting moments, but I think for the U.S. and China, it's the worsening political relationship that will drive this.
Okay. James Lewis, Chaoqun Duo, and Glenn Carl, it's been good to talk to all of you. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, we look at the challengers competing to be Brazil's next president. Is it a choice between a conservative misogynist and a corrupt liberal? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.